This is the podcast overview for the objectives for Chapter 15, Psychological Therapies. You'll be starting out the chapter by describing how the treatment of psychological disorders has changed throughout history. So you'll be taking a look at some early examples of how people were treated when they had a mental illness and how we really didn't know much about many of the mental illnesses, and so it was kind of trial by error. And you'll see how we've progressed over time. You'll start with some of the basic elements of Freud's psychoanalysis and psychodynamic approaches, and how some of those are still held today with the newer Freudians and newer psychoanalytic techniques that are being used, and how they are different from some of the original work of Freud. Then we'll look at identifying the basic elements of the humanistic therapies, which are known as person-centered therapy and Gestalt therapy. Those two types are called humanistic. And if you'll recall, Maslow and Rogers are those humanistic psychologists that we learned about earlier in the semester. And they have a particular approach to mental illness. And these types of therapies work specifically better with some illnesses than others. So you'll learn about sort of what types of illnesses both psychoanalysis and humanistic therapies might treat. Then you'll explain how behavior therapists use things like classical and operant conditioning to treat disordered behavior. So that's in the behavioral treatment. And then look at some of the goals and basic elements of cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapies, which are much more mind-centered on your thoughts and your thought patterns, and then how those translate into your behaviors. So kind of linking the two. You'll be comparing and contrasting the different forms of group therapy. So there are definitely reasons why group therapy works well and reasons it doesn't. So advantages and disadvantages to group therapy, you'll want to be familiar with what those are. And then summarize the research on the effectiveness of psychotherapy. How effective is it for treating specific illnesses? And then identify factors that influence the effectiveness of therapy. And those could be individual factors about the person. It can be factors about the type of therapy. It can be factors about the environment in which the person lives, and so forth. Then we'll be looking at categorizing the different types of drugs used to treat psychological disorders. So this is the biomedical approach, often combined with therapy. But there are specific drug classes that are used to treat particular psychological disorders, and you'll want to be familiar with those. You'll also want to be familiar with how electroconvulsive therapy and psychosurgery can also be used to treat psychological disorders, and when are they used. Usually they are a last-ditch effort. When biomedical avenues haven't panned out and therapy hasn't panned out, one might go that route, only for certain kinds of mental illnesses. So please be sure you understand which ones and why. And then identify some of the newer technologies being used to treat psychological disorders. What kinds of things are being done today? Lots in the neuropsych field that are promising. And then we're going to just end with describing how regular physical exercise and spending time in nature, as well as sleep, can really benefit one's mental health, and some different strategies that as a society and as a culture we can be using to reduce the stigma often associated with mental illness or associated with just seeking help for a psychological disorder. We are breaking down those walls currently. Today is much better than it used to be, but we need people to understand that having a psychological disorder is just like having a physical disorder. And you wouldn't ever be ashamed to go to a doctor for your heart, so why are we ashamed to go to a doctor for your mind? And I would say that we're not as much anymore. But some of those stigmas still do exist, and so we want to discover ways that we can continue to dismantle some of those stigmas. And that will wrap up this week's chapter, 15 Psychological Therapies.